X-Kaliber. They spelled it with an X to be hip with the kids, with their skateboards and their Walkmans and their totally tubular hyper-colored shirts and what have you. It's the future. Some guy with a sword has donked up the entire city, and it's up to some other guy with another sword, who looks very similar to the previously mentioned guy with a sword, to go and fix everything, and they're totally not brothers. The gameplay is a little bit awkward, and while basic movement is fairly quick and responsive, you stop instantly when you attack. This isn't too big of a deal, except with the ranged slash, because you end up having to wait 2 or 3 seconds before you can move again. As well, jumping has a fairly fluid control until you attack, which stops you in midair and drops you. That's incredibly annoying, especially with enemies coming at you at high speeds and precise platforming later on. In addition, the boss fights are completely frustrating from a mechanical standpoint. Bosses can block potentially every move you throw at them, which means you have to constantly spam attacks just to try and hit them once or twice. On top of that, most of the bosses have a range greater than your character. Even the heavy attack, which has additional reach, still can get zoned out by pretty much every boss, who can already block every move. It's really frustrating because it's hard to find an opportunity to attack. In fact, most of the time, it feels more like trying to figure out the weird programming quirk that each boss has. Like one of the later guys, if you tap block and then just normal attack, you will get him into a permanent loop where he just won't do anything. And if that didn't already make boss fights incredibly stacked against you, every potential move you would want to block with your block ability, your enemy can attack straight through and hurt you. So yeah, fights are just straight up unfair. And that's no fun. Overall, I think the game looks okay. The environments and characters are all fairly detailed, although the environments are a little too grimy looking. Like, there's just not enough variance in the palette. There's too much brown and gray. But the backgrounds themselves look fairly impressive. And pretty much all the characters look like they just jumped out of a comic book, which gives them a sort of cheesy, sort of 80s comic book vibe. And I really dig that. In between stages, there's also slideshow cutscenes, which look like they were ripped straight out of a comic book as well, which just gives the game a greater comic book feel. And that's cool. The soundtrack is pretty interesting with this game. And what's interesting is the Japanese release, Sword Maniac, and the North American release, X-Kaliber, were actually given 2 completely different soundtracks by 2 different composers altogether. They also had completely different stories, but I can't really talk too much about that. The North American soundtrack was composed by an American techno band by the name of Psychosonic, and the soundtrack is, well, generic techno. Honestly, it's not that great, and over the course of the next 6 levels, you hear at least each stage theme twice. They never bothered to make a different stage theme for each one, and given the fact that the soundtrack is already kind of bland, just made it boring. Speaking of boring, let's talk about the level design, because that is pretty boring. Borderline on terrible. Okay, so each of the 6 stages is delivered in 2 or 3 different chunks, followed by a boss fight. Now, none of these areas are all that interesting. Some of them are just flat corridors with no real opposition whatsoever, and at that point I have to question why it's there. And on the worst end of it, you have vertical scrolling platformers with precise platforming and aerial enemies that can knock you down to the beginning, and of course you can't maneuver yourself in midair. There's also no post-damage invulnerability, which makes vertical scrolling platforming, as well as precise platforming, almost impossible when you have high-speed enemies coming from the left and the right. So, it's pretty awful. That said, there are still some really cool moments in this game, such as a giant fire getting set, and you having to rush to an elevator in the next building. That was cool. But for every one moment of those, you have 2 bosses that can outzone you, or 2 flat corridors, or 1 giant long corridor with enemies moving way too fast for you to react to and getting knocked down and then falling into a pit or something. The stage design is just really freaking terrible, and in the end it feels like it wasn't designed with the character in mind. I think that if there was more time given to the stage design, it would have been a lot better. But in essence, that's X-Kaliber, a game of fairly low caliber, and I can't really recommend it to anyone unless they're the kind of person who has to have a complete Super Nintendo library. In which case, good luck to you. This game certainly won't cost you anywhere near as much as Hagane will, but that said, I'm sure Hagane is a much better game.